Hi there. This is Lacey. And today I'd like to start with a question. Do you remember where you were when America killed the most wanted terrorist in the world?
Tonight, I can report to the American people that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama Bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda.
As of May 2nd, the day this episode comes out, that spring evening was 11 years ago. And for roughly 43,000 Americans, the answer to that question is that they were at the game.
Now the pitch, and it's line foul into the seats.
It was the bottom of the eighth at the Phillies Stadium where the home team faced off against the New York Mets.
All around Citizens Bank Park there chanting, USA, USA. Boy, news travels fast, even in the ballpark.
Similar scenes played out across the country. In Times Square.
Very excited about it. I think it helps the psyche of all the Americans.
And the White House.
USA! USA!
And Ground Zero in Manhattan. Speaking of Obama, he made one other shout out during the announcement.
But it's important to note that our counterterrorism cooperation with Pakistan helped lead us to bin Laden.
Yeah, about that. The feeling was not mutual in Pakistan, as was clear in local coverage following the announcement.
He says no outside forces should be allowed to enter Pakistani territory. It's a violation of our sovereignty, and we should give no country permission to do that.
As the U.S. took its victory lap, details of the search for bin Laden started to leak in the press. Like this moment in early 2012, when Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta was interviewed on 60 Minutes.
There is a Pakistani doctor who, as we understand it, was helping our efforts there, a man named Sheikh Afridi.
Who allegedly ran a hepatitis vaccine program in Abbottabad with the CIA to find bin Laden. See, the U.S. wanted to collect DNA from local kids to prove that bin Laden's family was living there. It was a project kept totally secret from the Pakistani government and even from Afridi's staff.
He's now been charged with treason in Pakistan.
And the vaccines weren't even given correctly. Parents found out months later that their kids weren't even protected, which Panetta's comments glossed right over.
He was not in any way treasonous towards Pakistan. He was not in any way doing anything that would have undermined Pakistan. As a matter of fact, for them to take this kind of action against somebody who was helping to go after terrorism, I just think is a real mistake on their part.
A position that some members of Congress were happy to back.
I think this is an abomination.
Despicable.
This man is really an international hero. They should be erecting statues to him.
But with all of this outrage in Washington, one question was missing. What did this fiasco mean for Pakistani civilians who were living in a region where healthcare workers had spent years trying to convince them that vaccines were safe?
5 female health workers involved in a vaccination program to eradicate polio have been shot dead in Pakistan.
The doors have been locked and the work of the Save the Children Fund stopped in Pakistan.
I don't have any statements for you from lawmakers on those headlines. In fact, you could spend an hour watching old U.S. coverage of bin Laden's death and Afridi's arrest without learning any meaningful details about how the U.S. determined that this plot passed ethical muster, or that when the CIA promised not to do something like this again, pressure didn't actually come from Capitol Hill. So in this episode, we're going to tell you 2 stories that we hoped might give us some answers. This is Things That Go Boom.
What is actually going on with the economy nowadays? The price of gas, inflation. Are we in a recession? I'm Jeff Guo, co-host of NPR's Planet Money. Come along with our super team of econ experts as we delve into the stories that show you how the world really works. That's Planet Money from NPR.
Before we go any further, I want to let you know that this part of our show will mention sexual violence. Okay, back to the show. To understand how a mission like the Pakistani vaccine ruse was greenlit, you need to understand it as part of a long American history of justifying the means to an end. especially when that end feels existential. So we'll come back to bin Laden in a bit. But first, I want to take you back to one of the CIA's first major scandals.
My name is Lana Ponting. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. In 1958, I was admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute. I was born in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I went to the same school that Paul Anka did, which was Fisher Park High School. I had an average teenage life. I had friends and the occasional boyfriend and stuff like that. But then things took for the worst.
Lana was having trouble at home. She often butted heads with her parents, especially her stepmom.
I just wanted to be my own person. I wanted to be a singer. I wanted to be like Celine Dion. She wasn't that well known then, but I wanted to be a big star. Music is a very, very big part of my life, and I made no bones about it that that's what I wanted to do. My father and my stepmother took me to see, I think it was a psychiatrist once, and this doctor told my parents that I had a behavioral problem, and perhaps they should put me in the Allen Memorial Institute. And I knew by the sounds of it that I wasn't going to like it.
The Allen Memorial Institute was a psychiatric hospital in Montreal, in the former home of a shipping tycoon.
I thought it looked like a haunted mansion. It was dark, gloomy looking, and it was a horrible looking place from the outside.
Lana was 16 when a juvenile judge sentenced her to treatment at the Allen by Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. She remembers him as a tall man with gray hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a white coat.
He told my parents right in front of me that he will make sure that I will be better when I come out than I am when I went in. Instant dislike. I did not like him.
What happened in the next month changed Lana's life forever.
They gave me a glass of Kool-Aid, and I noticed it had a very funny taste to it. And I found out that it had LSD in it.
It was the first of Dr. Cameron's many so-called treatments, including forced druggings, electroshock therapy, and, she alleges, assault.
Once I was in a room. I was tied down to a table. I had a thing put in my mouth so that I wouldn't swallow my tongue. Then I was raped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I had that stupid thing in my mouth. I couldn't cry. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything.
Alongside electroshock treatments, patients were forced to listen to audio recordings for hours on end.
Your mother does not like you. Your father hates you, and over and over and over and over and over again, things like that. It was torture. It made you feel like you were worth nothing. You were like a puppet. My sister Wendy came up to visit me one day. I didn't know who in the hell she was. She said I acted just like a zombie. I was just like off in a trance. I didn't know anything or anybody. It's like living in a horror movie. And then I ended up on medication that I'm currently on and will be. I'm 80 years old now. I was a child of 16. And he took my childhood away from me.
Lana eventually got married, and she had 2 children. But she never told anybody about what happened at the Allen. Decades went by before she learned the truth, that she, along with many others, had been a guinea pig, and that the work of the man who tortured her, Dr. Cameron, it had been funded by the CIA, along with her own government.
Cameron had this godlike reputation that he could cure anything.
That's Julie Tanney.
I mean, he couldn't think of enough associations to be president of. There was the Canadian Psychiatric Association and the American Psychiatric Association and the World Psychiatric, like a real egomaniac,
Her father, Charles, was also a patient at the Allen Memorial Institute. He had entered the Allen in 1957 for nerve pain in his face. A psychiatrist had told him that the condition was all in his head. The psychiatrist, not so coincidentally, was working with Cameron.
My mother told me that when she tried to get information about what they were doing to my father, she couldn't get anything. And that's because everybody feared this man. He was so revered that they just shut them out. One of the things we read in the records was as soon as he was admitted, he was immediately given insulin. And like when we read that, was like, why? My father wasn't diabetic, but they used it to put the patient in a coma.
This was one step in a process that Cameron called psychic driving, aka attempted brainwashing. First, he used drugs, forced sleep, and electroshock therapy to try and wipe a patient's memory. And with it, their thoughts, their personality, and even their loved ones.
And then he was going to re-implant new thoughts. As crazy as it sounds, that's exactly what it is. It's taking your usual thought processes and just erasing everything that you've ever known and putting in all new thoughts.
Tanny was kept mostly asleep in a hospital bed for 56 days.
They only were woken up for an hour to eat and go to the bathroom. But other than that, they were 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. In his medical records, it says after 30 days of sleep treatment with the psychic driving, it seems that we're very disappointed with the results for Mr. Tanny because he still has ties to his former life by asking to see his wife.
Cameron's treatments caught the eye of the CIA in the early 50s.
In the background was the growing struggle between two great powers to shape the post-war world.
It was the start of the Cold War, and the agency was consumed by what director Alan Dulles called the battle for men's minds.
Already an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria.
He claimed that the Soviets had developed, quote, brain warfare, capable of controlling American soldiers and enticing citizens toward communism.
Ah, but this is Europe, you say. But let's see what can happen elsewhere in, say, the small town of Mosinee, Wisconsin. Peaceful, isn't it?
To Dulles, this was a potentially world-altering weapon. Here's what lead psychiatrist John Gittinger later told the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
The project, dubbed MK Ultra, cost the agency around $10 million, which would be over $100 million today. Researchers in the US and Canada, including Cameron, were paid through front organizations like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. The result was civilian torture in 2 countries without any sign-off from Congress.
My father was a very engaged parent. He was always taking us on little trips and little surprises. And every weekend it was something, you know. He made us a skating rink in the backyard, and there was always something. And after the Allen, there was nothing. You know, my mother became detached. My father became detached. We were really left on our own. It was a really frightening time. My father actually became quite physically violent with me. You know, he never touched me before, but he came out very angry, which is, when you read a lot of the stories, it's a very common thread.
MK Ultra lasted nearly 20 years, from 1953 to the early 70s. So how did the CIA pull off such an expensive and unethical project?
Basically, what Congress did is it decided to kind of give a bunch of money over to the CIA and more or less no questions asked.
That's Yale law professor Ona Hathaway.
That was a considered decision for 2 reasons. The main one being that there's obviously security issues. You know, if the CIA was to detail in significant, in enough detail, all of the various programs that it's doing, that would have to be done in a classified way. You'd have to have members of Congress who could review it in a classified way. And they just didn't really have that set up.
The second reason, she says, was just a lack of appetite and maybe understanding about what even was going on at the CIA in the name of national security.
What really happened is that Seymour Hersh wrote a series of articles that really brought into the American public's awareness a variety of things the CIA had been up to that, previously no one had known about.
It was 1974, and MK Ultra was just one skeleton in the CIA's closet. The agency had intelligence files on at least 10,000 citizens, It infiltrated student anti-war protests, screened private mail, and even broke into homes. And then there was the foreign election meddling.
That got many Americans upset, and therefore Congress got activated to do something about it. So they formed these committees, the Church Committee and the Pike Committee, to investigate intelligence abuses.
2 years later, in 1977, these revelations yielded what Ona calls the Big Bang of intelligence oversight, the creation of the House and Senate Select Intelligence Committees.
That structural shift was really crucial to kind of making it possible for Congress to actually know what was going on in the intelligence community, to be able to actually oversee all of these activities, to have a mechanism for being briefed. And so that was kind of the fundamental structural reform that was essential to getting Congress back into the game.
When we set out to make this season, this is the sort of story we had in mind, where Congress learns something and change follows. Maybe that reading misses something bigger that impacts oversight to this day. Charles Taney and Lana Ponting suffered the worst days of their lives alongside dozens of others at the Allen Memorial Institute. Meanwhile, the U.S. thought it had invested in defeating an existential enemy. In that sense, it feels like MK-Ultra and America's war on terror share some DNA. When the war drum is beating that loudly, where does it leave lawmakers tasked with checking and balancing? And what kind of security system do we get in return? The U.S. defines covert action as anything done by our government to influence foreign affairs in ways that won't be obvious or acknowledged. It's a pretty straightforward idea held up by one of the world's biggest and most expensive bureaucracies. Here's Ona Hathaway.
We don't know the exact numbers from the last few years because they haven't been released, but the last published numbers we have is about 50 million new classified documents being created every year.
The executive branch decides how classified information is organized and maintained. The last president to update that system was Barack Obama in 2009.
It follows a pattern that's been used now for quite some time, which is there's sort of three main levels. There's confidential, there's secret, and there's top secret. And then within cross-cutting that, there's also what's called compartments of information. And so information can be either secret or top secret and compartmented. So just because you have access to top secret information doesn't mean that you have access to all the compartments. In fact, nobody, I think, but the president, vice president, a few very top-level government officials have access to all of the compartments.
Ona briefly worked for general counsel at the Department of Defense during Obama's second term, which included a coveted top-secret security clearance.
I came in thinking, wow, now I get to see I get to see behind the curtain. I get to see all the cool stuff. And in fact, it was sometimes hard to keep in mind whether something I had read about had been in a top secret briefing or in the New York Times that morning. It's the information is not always that easy to distinguish, honestly, and sometimes the information is very similar. It's nowhere near as exciting as you imagine it will be.
And in some cases, she found herself thinking, why is this even classified?
Because there are these three levels of classification, there are three completely separate computer systems. They can't talk to each other. And so what ends up happening is that if people want stuff to be seen, they tend to put it on the highest level, or they often put it on the highest level, even if it really doesn't need to be there.
That's how, in one case, she remembers that an e-Christmas card sent to defense staff ended up stamped top secret. But for a system that's so thorough, that doesn't mean the congressional oversight will be too. On paper, the CIA is past its cowboy days. It's required to share all major intelligence activity with congressional committees. But under our laws, Congress can only ask questions about covert operations. It can't actually veto any plans. And even just asking questions can be difficult. The picture that lawmakers might get of a covert project could be the information equivalent of a Swiss cheese slice.
Generally speaking, you don't get access to one of these programs unless you have a demonstrated need to have access to it. And members of Congress, they may argue that they should get access to a compartment, but they may not get it.
They may not even know it exists.
Even the code names that describe the compartments, those are classified. So if you're read into a compartment, you can't even tell somebody what the compartment is that you're read into unless they're in the compartment themselves, right? So it's this catch-22 that people don't even know what they don't know. And that's exactly how the intelligence community wants it.
It's a system where important details can pretty easily get snared in bureaucracy. And even when lawmakers get the full picture, Ona says the real question is, what can they actually do with that information?
Let's say they hear something that they think is problematic. They do have at least one staffer who's staffing their work with the committee, but not all those staffers are read into all the programs that the member of Congress might be read into. And so that can really impede the ability of the member of Congress to work with their staff, much less talk to the American public about, or their constituents about what they think is wrong. Because they can't really go on the news and say, I learned about this terrible program. It's really awful, that there's these horrible things that the CIA is doing. You can't do that. That's revealing classified information.
Which, as a reminder, is mostly very, very illegal.
They probably can't be prosecuted for what they say on the floor of the House or Senate. So in a really extraordinary circumstance, they could do that, but that would be disclosing classified information. They'd probably never be given classified information by the intelligence community again, and it would be seen as pretty transgressive.
The elephant in the room being that whistleblowers are silenced. Others choose to silence themselves because who wants to look untrustworthy or even like a traitor? Most of the time, it's easier just not to risk it. This internal struggle ultimately benefits an extremely cautious security culture, arguably to the point of weakening guardrails that are aimed at preventing civilian harm or illegal operations.
It is no secret that the United States used torture in the years following 9/11.
The brutality is shocking.
Stripped naked, diapered, physically struck.
We did some things that were contrary to our values.
The CIA lied to Congress and the Bush administration for years about the intensity of its enhanced interrogation tactics.
The Senate began an investigation. There was a study of the Central Intelligence Agency's detention and interrogation program. And they did this extensive program of study where they collected all this information and about all the various reports of these black sites and what had happened at these black sites.
Not to mention its torture methods were partly descended from the MK-Ultra experiments. The report laid this out and was approved for release in 2012.
And then started this big fight with the Central Intelligence Agency about whether it could actually be disclosed.
But then the CIA tried to pull the plug, claiming that it had the final say over what classified information got published, a system that Congress actually has no legal authority over.
That creates a real challenging situation because this is a report that's highly critical of the CIA, that is laying out details of a deeply troubling, illegal program that had been carried on for years by CIA personnel. At one point, Dianne Feinstein basically seemed ready to sort of call their bluff and just release it.
If the Senate can declassify this report, we will be able to ensure that an un-American, brutal program will never again be considered or permitted.
That was Dianne Feinstein on the Senate floor in 2014. Relations between senators and the CIA were at a very public, claws-out low point. They had both tried to sic the Justice Department on the other. And in that nearly 40-minute speech, Feinstein accused the CIA of searching Senate computers and targeting staff over their handling of classified documents.
I view the acting consul general's referral as a potential effort to intimidate this staff, and I am not taking it lightly.
It was a program that had, at that point, been brought to a close, and yet the CIA was still incredibly protective of all the information that was being released. And, I can understand why they didn't want that information out there, but that is the kind of information that the American public has a right to see. It's a good thing that Congress stuck to its guns, I think.
That hasn't always happened. It's not always wise to criticize covert action tied to a major U.S. goal, like, say, a multi-trillion-dollar, 20-plus year war on terror.
Nobody wants to be the person who is responsible for the next attack. And I think particularly this was true in the years after 9/11. People felt very strongly that the next attack could be coming, and we kind of have to do everything possible to prevent it.
Which brings us back to the search for bin Laden. From the administration's perspective, Ona says there was a good reason to keep the vaccine operation so close to the chest. For starters, he'd gotten away before.
But this is one of the consequences of these kinds of very narrow clearance programs, is that you don't always have the information that you need to make the most informed decisions that you would want to.
Remember that 60 Minutes interview with Leon Panetta when he admitted that the CIA vaccine ruse was real? Well, people like Sam Worthington, they were stunned. Sam is the CEO of Interaction, a non-governmental organization, or NGO, that develops humanitarian policy with groups across the world.
Well, immediately afterwards, I mean, one of the things that sort of you get this out in the public is you get, different parties taking advantage of it. The Taliban immediately used this as a anti-vaccine campaign and started making a push that vaccines contained pig fat, and forbidden for Muslims, and that they were trying to sterilize Muslims. So all sorts of disinformation came out linking vaccines or people who were also delivering vaccines as being CIA spies. So you immediately put health workers at risk. And within that first year, some 70 health workers lost their lives.
Sam was so horrified that he decided to write directly to the CIA. He addressed the letter to General David Petraeus, Obama's new CIA director.
I, first acknowledged that there was clearly a national security interest in going after bin Laden, but that there was also U.S. national security at stake in the ability of nonprofits around the world to save lives. And that ultimately they were independent of any particular government policy. So by taking this action, you have, in essence, commingled an intelligence tool with our humanitarian work, and that is completely unacceptable.
Members of the public health community complained too, including 12 deans of the nation's top medical schools. Sam figured that his letter would probably get some generic response.
I was surprised to get a call from the leadership at the CIA asking us to come over and to discuss the matter.
So he goes to CIA headquarters and hashes it out with officials.
My sense is, at least in that conversation, that this was an exception for them. That going in this way after bin Laden and using a vaccine and a association with humanitarian activity was an exception, and that it was an exception because it was so serious and needed to be considered, and that they would return to their normal activity of, in essence, viewing us as off limits, though it wasn't quite said in that way.
But the damage was already done. The next day, Sam got a call from Pakistan's ambassador.
He thought that all U.S. NGOs operating in Pakistan were fronts for the CIA, which is something I not only denied, but said that's completely antithetical to who we are, why we exist, and we have no interest whatsoever and would completely push back against any infiltration, which is what I had done the day before at the CIA. I don't think he believed me.
It was the first of many severed relationships between the country and humanitarian groups.
By 2018, some 7 years later, the Pakistan government expelled 18 largest NGOs operating in Pakistan.
Hundreds of staff were forced to leave, staff who were working on programs that impacted millions of children, some of which had nothing to do with public health, like flood relief. Years of hard-won trust within communities was gone. And perhaps most troubling, in a country where preventable diseases are still endemic, like polio and hepatitis C, ultimately Sam says that families paid the price, and they continue to do so.
In most recent things, this is only going back a year or so, this research that vaccine rates have dropped by 2/5. So you have a 40% decrease in vaccination rates in Pakistan. Now, whether this is directly attributable to the CIA, I can't say, but it's clearly complicated, Pakistan's current efforts to vaccinate people against COVID, and that there's polls in Islamabad and other places that they're really struggling to persuade the Pakistani people that this is something that they should get.
In the end, the CIA's public promise not to do it again came after pressure from advocates, not from Congress. It's worth asking not just why, but if given Congress's oversight toolbox, a mistake like this was even preventable. Some efforts to address Congress's problems have succeeded. Late last year, Chuck Schumer announced that one staff member from each senator's office would get a top-secret clearance. It was a wonky bipartisan change in Senate rules, ultimately meaning that more eyes on the Hill would see more intel. With that shift, maybe the chance of something problematic getting flagged went up. And yet, it feels like those changes don't go far enough. They ignore the culture behind how a vaccine ruse gets greenlit and the assumptions that pitch involves. Like the assumption, for example, that covert action is essential to keeping us safe. And when things do go sideways and the consequences pile up, that a public postmortem will bring us back to some moral base. But those ideas aren't so easy to square with the fallout of cases like MKUltra or the vaccine ruse, the private chaos they caused, or the generational trauma. It's taken decades for families like Julie Tanny's to seek recourse for their loved ones. Julie learned her dad's story as an adult.
I was at my mother's for dinner one night, and the news broke that this Mrs. Orlico, who was the wife of a member of parliament from Winnipeg, was suing the CIA because she was in that program too. I remember it like yesterday because as soon as it came on, my mother turned to my brother, who they were on both sides of me. My mother turns to my brother and she says, "Go to the hospital tomorrow and get the records." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? What are you talking about?" So my mother got the records and she went to a lawyer and she was going to sue for $1 million, which was a ton of money in the 70s. But the lawyer told her it was going to cost her about over $100,000.
In 1992, over 30 years after Charles Tanny's torture, Canada offered Allen survivors $100,000 in restitution. By that point, Julie says her mom had spent $2 million on his care. He had 2 heart attacks after leaving the Allen and later a stroke. He spent 20 years unable to move or communicate. Julie believes it's all connected.
My father was the first one to get paid because my father was actually on his deathbed at the time, like going to die any minute when they announced this. And you had to be alive to get it. My brother ran to Toronto to get the check and put it in the bank. And as soon as I told my father that the check had come in, he died.
Today, Julie's spearheading the latest legal fight for accountability in Canada, a class-action multi-million-dollar lawsuit that would pay survivors and their families. Lana Ponting is part of that lawsuit.
It's not easy for me to tell the story of what happened to me, but I'm doing it because the truth has to come out. So many people have been hurt financially, physically, mentally, every other way you can think of. This is not a movie. This really happened.
But the money, Lana says, is only part of why she's involved herself at 80 years old. She wants an apology from the U.S. and Canadian governments. I asked Julie if that would help her too.
The politicians today, half of them don't even know about this, and the other half know and they really don't care. An apology from people who had nothing to do with it is meaningless to me. I want to get paid back for the money that my mother lost because it affected all of us. I mean, my mother died right after my father. She took care of him for all those years, and as soon as he died, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I can't bring her back, but somebody has to be held accountable.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. This episode was produced by Christina Stella and me and edited by Nikki Galtelin, Sahar Khan, and Aline Geistel. Our music for this show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes each episode sound its very best. Special thanks to Lisa Ellenwood at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She's covered the story of MKUltra for years. And if you'd like to learn more about the Allen Memorial Institute, I highly recommend the podcast Brainwashed, which she produced for the CBC. Thanks to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Coulomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. If you're listening and you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. please go ahead and leave us a review and come by and visit us anytime on social at Inkstick Media. We'll see you soon.
Now I guess I am ready to go and have a smoke. Oh, yes. I need my smoke right now.
From PRX.